This video is long overdue. I've been meaning to talk about how I feel about all of the tanks for quite some time now, probably over the last few weeks, but every time I sit down to record this video, Blizzard makes a change. There's more testing, there's dungeon nerfs, there's raid nerfs, raid buffs, whatever it might be. So now that we finally have a candidate build, potential candidate build for 10.2, I really wanted to take some time to talk about the cadence of each of the tanks, how they're playing, how they're interacting with their tier set, and how I think they're going to perform this tier in Mythic Plus, though this video is mostly going to focus on playstyle cadence, along with how enjoyable the tank is from my perspective. So again, it's extremely subjective. So like I said, mostly going to be focusing on performance. I'm assuming that you're going to know what all of the tier sets do generally. So if you missed my videos covering how the tier sets interact, they are a little old. There have been some updates, but I have done videos about it. I'll throw them up on screen whenever I get to said tank. And with that being said, if you're looking to just hear about one specific tank or two specific tanks or something, use the timeline below to navigate through the video. This is going to be kind of a long rant. I've recorded this video 10 times or so now, and every time it ends up being 30 to 40 minutes long. So I'm going to try to cut it down a little bit, but we'll see. All right, with all of the disclaimers out of the way, let's just dive in. We're going to start off with the Blood Death Knight. Now, for anyone who's watched my channel for any amount of time at all, or who's stopped by my stream, you probably know that I'm not a big fan of the Blood Death Knight. Now, that's not to say that I don't think this upcoming tier set is really cool. It's really strong. And Death Knight has a lot going for it going into this next patch in terms of Mythic Plus, and there are some potential strong assets that it can bring in Raid as well, and I'm going to go over those here shortly. Over the patch cycle, we've seen a handful of changes to the tier sets. We've seen it get shifted from Bone Shield consumption to Runic Power spending. The uptime was increased a little bit, and this was mostly to target the issues it was having in single target. Because with Bone Shield consumption, if you're only getting hit by one mob, or maybe a mob that doesn't often, melee you, there's a couple of bosses in the past. Everbloom is a good example this upcoming patch. There's a boss called Archmage Soul. Doesn't really melee the tank. In the past, we think of things like Medivh from Karazhan. Also a boss that doesn't really melee. So when you have Bone Shield drops required to interact with your tier set, it feels really bad in those situations. Or if you're in a raid environment and you're off tanking and you're just not getting hit by anything for a long period of time, that also feels really bad. So Blizzard did a good job at coming around and changing this to Runic Power spent to make it a little bit more consistent. In single target, we saw an up on this. In AoE, a little bit of a downgrade, but in general across the board, just higher uptime. Now, the 4 set is really, really cool and interacts really well with the Blood Death Knight as well. You have Abomination Limb now being an extremely powerful cooldown, giving you Ashen Decay and applying it to every target just while it's active. So you pretty much have a 10 or 12 second aura of this being applied. And then also the 4 set, Blood Boil and Heartstrike extends that buff even longer. So after you use Abomination Limb, you're seeing, 20 to 30 seconds, depending on haste values, of just having Ashen Decay, having a 20% damage amp on all targets, having a 10% kind of flat-ish DR, which isn't as important for the Death Knight, I think, but the damage gain is insane. So Blood Death Knight, in the terms of damage, is looking really competitive this patch compared to previous patches. Death Knight's always been known as the tank. You can self-heal and keep yourself alive basically through almost anything, but the cost is damage. But now that's not really the case. You're just doing a ton of healing, you're doing a ton of damage, and you have a really good kit. In terms of Mythic Plus, I think they're going to be a strong candidate for a meta choice. I think they'll fall short of Vengeance Demon Hunter, which I'll talk about more in that section. But Death Knight has a great kits. Their healing and the way that they kind of mitigate damage, it's not so much about armor value compared to, appropriately death striking. And with more of a magic-focused dungeon profile this upcoming patch, they're looking really good. You have AMS, you have AMZ, Deathstrike is obviously really good, Vamp Blood is also really good, and you have a ton of DRs through things like Rune Tap, Icebound Fortitude, Lichborn, and I already mentioned AMS, but you just have a ton of different ways to handle a lot of the casters. So Death Knight, if you're a Death Knight main or you're on the fence, you gotta play it. Also, not to mention that their set looks badass. I don't care who you are, having skulls and spikes and flowing like runic power throughout the armor looks just amazing. The jaw moves with your character, so that's just an added bonus. On top of that, you have access to the legendary. So that's something to keep in mind. You're going to be the only tank who can actually wield the legendary Axe of Fearock. That's going to be powerful. As at the time of recording this video, we still don't know what the effect is, but you have to take that into an account in terms of power level. Now, I do want to quickly talk about the Soul Reaper aspect of the tier set because I think it's important to note. And this is a lot of theory crafting. I'm not a Death Knight main. I don't pretend to be. I do like to play Death Knight on the PTR, and I like to do the testing. I feel like I'm okay at it. Typically, I have to shake the rust off a little bit. But Soul Reaper might not see a major play in Mythic Plus or maybe on Tyrannical weeks. But Soul Reaper by itself has always been like an ability that it's fine, but when you have to pick that or Empower Rune Weapon, you would typically pick Empower Rune Weapon because it gives you haste, it gives you runes back, and runic power. Just all around a great 2-minute cooldown to pair with Abomination Limb or to throw on top of your Dancing Rune Weapon. Soul Reaper now, when a mob is sub 35%, you're going to have permanent Ashen Decay uptime. Soul Reaper hits extremely hard. When I was testing on the PTR, we were seeing 100k hits. During Dancing Rune Weapon, it hits 3 times, so you're seeing a 300k hit, roughly, depending on crits and stuff, every, 6 seconds. In a Dancing Rune Weapon window, you can cast 3 Soul Reapers. You Dancing Rune Weapon, Soul Reaper, 6 seconds later, again, you Soul Reaper, and then right before Dancing Rune Weapon expires, you Soul Reaper into maybe a Marrow Rent to refresh your Bone Shield charges. Very powerful, very hard-hitting ability that gives you basically permanent uptime in execute range to make sure your damage is maintained or just increased. So all of a sudden, Death Knight becomes a very, very strong execute class, and we don't really have that in the tank pool. You have warriors who have execute, but without taking execute-based talents as a prot warrior, your execute's kind of average, I would say. You can spam it. We saw in Halls of Infusion on the first boss, you were able to use it as kind of a filler, but you still need to spend rage on Ignore Pain, making sure your shield block is active so your shield slam hits harder and whatnot. So for the first time, we're seeing an execute tank that can actually do insane execute damage because of their tier set. So the Death Knight might find itself in a competitive raid spot this tier in terms of World First or Hall of Fame. Now, this is just theory crafting again, but I think the Death Knight is just a great, great pick this tier. With that out of the way, let's jump over to the Vengeance Demon Hunter. I would say out of all 6 tanks, I would say that Vengeance Demon Hunter's, well, its rework is incredible, but I think it's going to be a very competitive tank, similar to the reasons why the Death Knight is, but I think the Vengeance Demon Hunter is going to pull ahead in terms of performance because of their utility kit. Now, if you're living under a rock or you're not really following the notes on the PTR, Vengeance Demon Hunter got a pretty good overhaul and rework to its class. And as we've seen so far over the patch cadence of Dragonflight, any tank that's reworked is typically pretty fucking good in the following season or patch. So we saw this with Prop Paladin in the 10.05 patch, or 10.07, I forgot when they were reworked. And then we saw kind of the Guardian Druid take over in the 10.15 patch, and I think we're going to see a similar trend happen with the Vengeance Demon Hunter. I don't want to spend too much time here, but something that they did really, really well is they fixed a lot of the issues in the class and the spec tree with pathing. It's not all fixed, it's not perfect, but they remapped a lot of the talents. They took out some kind of pointless ones, they split some things up, they reduced 2 points to 1 points. So generally speaking, the Vengeance Demon Hunter has a lot less restrictions in terms of pathing, as well as what they can do. So what I'm talking about this is like things like Chaos Nova. It now like just generally costs less Fury to use, which is good. Has a shorter cooldown. Fell Devastation has a shorter cooldown. Capstones were kind of moved. They moved Elysian Decree over to the class tree, so now you have access to Elysian Decree while also still being able to take some good stuff over in the spec tree, which is just all around great. The big focus here now is on sigils, not so much on Fiery Brand uptime with Recrimination, which was the tier set from Season 2. You're not going to be spamming Soul Cleave, Spirit Bomb, Fracture as much. A lot of your Soul Frag generation is going to come from using sigils, using Immolation Aura. You'll Fracture / Shear here and there, but most likely you'll play Fracture due to haste. But the idea with the tier set is to make sure your Sigil of Flame uptime is as high as possible. This is great because you can now play 2 charges of all of your sigils thanks to a new talent called Illuminated Sigils. You have cooldown reduction through a Cycle of Binding, which is just fucking great. Any cooldown reduction class is just really fun. Most tanks now have cooldown reduction in their kit. You have things like Incarnation getting reduced with Ursoc's Guidance. Obviously, with Brewmaster, you have just Keg Smashing reduces all of your brews, like, Bone Dust Brew, Fortifying, well, fuck Fort Brew. Warriors obviously have Anger Management on top of their new tier set and some other things interacting with Demoralizing Shouts. Death Knights have Dancing Rune Weapon and, consumption of Bone Shield charges. So pretty much like all of your tank, and Paladin obviously has reduction based on Holy Power spent. So you have all of these tanks who've had cooldown reduction except the Demon Hunter. And all of a sudden now you have your primary way you deal damage and maintain your tier set having cooldown reduction, which just feels really good. So you Sigil of Flame, and then when you Elysian Decree afterwards, it's going to reduce that previously used Sigil of Change by 30 seconds. And then you're going to use Sigil of Silence to silence the pack that you're doing, handling. And all of a sudden then Elysian Decree and Sigil of Flame reduced by 3 seconds. And the tier set, when you can, consuming fragments and spending Fury is going to cause your Sigil of Flame to flare up, or to have cooldown reduction, additional cooldown reduction on top of Cycle of Binding, which just feels so good. Now, I've heard some backlash about some Demon Hunters like the simplistic playstyle it currently has, where they don't want to focus on sigils as much. I get that. I think this is a really healthy, change of pace. It kind of kills the left side of the tree in like frailty builds, but it is just a tier. We're used to, at least we used to be used to, tier sets changing the builds that we play, and I think that's no different in this case, where similar to the Season 2, where we focused a lot more on Fiery Brand talents, we're now focusing on Sigil talents. And I think Demon Hunter, if anything, has been the one tank that has had good changes over the course of the patch. I think each tier set has felt different. In Season 1, we played a pretty heavy Frailty build. In Season 2, we played a Fiery Brand build. Season 3, we're now playing a Sigil build. I think that's really healthy. I think the class's core design is still the same, but I like the kind of nuanced changes where it shifts the focus on our rotation. Now, holy shit, the Sigil utility that Demon Hunter has is through the roof, especially with the cooldown reduction and the second charge of all of your Sigils. Sigil of Silence locks down mobs for, 16 seconds every minute to 2 minutes, right? Because you have 2 charges and they don't cool down at the same time. But you can lock down a pack for pretty much ever. So you pair a Vengeance Demon Hunter with an Augmentation Evoker, and your group is set. They don't need to worry about anything. Because of the recent bug fixes and a couple of buffs to Sigil of Flame and some other talents, we're now seeing Demon Hunter have a lot more burst damage, a lot more sustained damage. Their Immolation Aura now ticks faster. Their Fiery Brand will spread faster as well. So you're seeing kind of playing it down into like Burning Alive, that heavy right side of the tree in the spec tree play, like a lot of talent plays down there. So I don't know, man. I think Vengeance Demon Hunter is a really strong candidate. I can't imagine a world where we don't see Vengeance Demon Hunter not be like a meta or a high performing tank. If you didn't like Demon Hunter before because of either spamming Spirit Bomb or Soul Cleaver or whatever, or the Recrimination Fiery Brand spreading, I think trying it this patch will warrant some different feelings, whether it be good or bad. And I think any Demon Hunter main will be extremely happy with these changes as long as you keep an open mind. All right, I've spent a long time talking about the last 2 tanks, but I'm going to kind of speed run these last couple. So let's talk about Guardian Druid briefly. Guardian Druid's going to be fine. If you're a Guardian Druid main, I don't think you should really worry about this next tier. It's a pretty massive power loss, but a lot of what made Guardian Druid strong in Season 2 wasn't necessarily how strong the tank is. Incarnation's a really powerful cooldown, but it's also the classes and the composition that you're playing with. Between being able to kind of just payphone your way through a key, on top of also having a comp that had cooldowns that were all kind of based around your Incarnation, allowed Guardian Druid to pull big. Fire Mage, Shadow Priest, Evoker were able to do really big damage. Paladin naturally keeps the group up. You kind of play more hug to melee. You have a lot of stacked healing, Guardian Druid heals, etc. Guardian Druid in the next patch is in a really weird spot, and I will admit that this is the tank that I've tested probably the least on throughout this PTR cycle, because it just doesn't feel good. Anyone who's been watching my channel for a very long time probably originally found my channel from when I pushed on the Guardian Druid back in Shadowlands and BFA. Man, those were the days. And honestly, I kind of miss the more spammy Thrash playstyle that Incarnation used to yield. And the new kind of teetering between like Thrash, Raise, Mangle, I just find it really stale. Where I felt like you had more to do when Incarnation was up, you literally paid phone. Like you just spam Thrash and Ironfur. You macroed it together and you just went ham. Obviously, I miss Ravenous Frenzy. But now it just, the rotation doesn't change ever. Where like during Incarnation, you would spam Thrash, and then outside you would kind of do your standard, Thrash, Mangle, swipe, or apply Moonfire here, use a utility button here, whatever. Where now it feels like your rotation is the same all the time. And that's why I don't like to play Guardian Druid as much anymore. Anyways, enough about why I don't play Guardian Druid. The reason why this new tier set feels bad is because we saw some nerfs to Blood Frenzy, and the season two tier set provided a lot extra damage and rage generation, which we're now losing, and we're trading it out for an extension on Rage of the Sleeper, and then when Rage of the Sleeper expires, based on the rage that we spend, it will give you an absorption shield that is basically a mini version of Rage of the Sleeper, if that makes sense. So Rage of the Sleeper is going to be extended from 10 seconds to 15. And then for 45 seconds after that, you're going to have an absorption shield that's going to absorb and reflect with the foreset in mind. It's going to reflect 25% of the damage you take until that absorb is fully eaten up. Now, they've done a lot of different iterations of this tier sets. I wish they scrapped it earlier and didn't try to make it work, because what they did is they tried to make this tier set work, and God, it feels fucking horrible, if I'm being honest, because in low content, the shield is never used. In high content, the shield is used pretty quickly, where then you feel like you have a gap. Because in the mid-level content, I would say maybe heroic, maybe some mythic rating. From my testing, depending on tuning, but we were scaled down item level, but I would say like maybe up to like 2022s, your tier set's going to last for, it's going to last for a majority of the duration, but it's going to get fully used up. The damage it does deal and the healing it does is great. The problem is in higher content, when it gets absorbed quicker, then you have a longer window or a longer duration where you don't have that active. What was nice about it in like kind of that mid-range content is you would have that as pretty much like a permanent 25% DR. Like if you were doing low enough content. In low content, the shield doesn't even get fully consumed. So you're just losing damage there. So it's like the damage you gain from the tier set is based on the damage you take. And that's fine, but then there's all of a sudden a hard cap because it's, the shield is capped. And I don't know if I'm explaining this well, but basically it's bad at the high end and it's bad at the low end. It's fine in the middle. I just wish that they would make it so the cap was a little higher. And this obviously is going to go up with item level, and we're testing it at 440. So, once you're maybe 470, 480, it's fine. But at the 440 item level, it feels really bad. And I wish in low content, maybe if if there is any amount of the shield remaining, it would maybe it would erupt, dealing that amount or a percentage of the remaining damage to your like nearby targets or something, because in low content, it's going to feel so wasted. Because it used to be based on the amount of damage you would deal, which is fine because it would scale with your character. So in lower content and you're, have a lower item level, you're doing less damage, therefore your absorb isn't as high, therefore the shield's going to get used, and it's scaled to your item level. Where now it's based on the rage you spend, and it doesn't really matter what item level you're at. You're going to be able to spend enough rage to cap the shield. And when that shield is capped, you're not getting through it. So the tier set, it's fine. It does good damage. If you're a bear player who does 20s to, a little bit higher, maybe it'll be fine. It's just going to feel bad. Also, the season's a little bit more magic heavy. You have less rage because of Blood Frenzy nerfs, or caps, I should say. So overall, Bear is just going to be mid. I don't think it's going to be the worst tank, which is saying a lot. I think Guardians are just going to kind of fall back into middle of the pack. So yeah, that's all I really have to say about that. All right, let's move on to the Paladin, because the Paladin, oddly enough, I think is a very, very strong tank. I think it's going to be competitive with the DK and up towards, the Demon Hunter in terms of kit. The major downfall that the set has is, I'm sure you've probably heard it if you're a Paladin player, is the consecration aspect of this tank and the tier set. Once you get your empowered buff, you throw down that consecration. If you have to move out of it, the tier set's gone. Devil's Advocate, play better, do what you can to optimize the position of your consecration. You can also bank said consecration until you know that a mechanic isn't going to force you to move from that location, but that doesn't really work in all instances. And the biggest example I can just think off the top of my head is in Mythic Plus this next upcoming season, you have Ataldazar, you have Razan as a boss who chases a player for 10 or whatever seconds, and you probably want to follow to continue doing damage because standing your consecration doesn't really do anything if you can't hit the boss. So if you're trying to chase Razan down, for example, like, you're going to move. It's inevitable. In raid encounters, I can't really speak much to it because I personally didn't test it, but there's a good bit of moving in these raid encounters. You place down your consecration, you get knocked back, you have to move, you have to go soak something, whatever it might be, you lose out on that damage. So the tier set by itself, in terms of pure damage, it's really good. It's very strong. The healing component of it isn't as great unless you play Golden Path, so in raid it might be a little bit better with a melee stack. In Mythic Plus with a melee cleave, it might be okay with Golden Path and, Seal of Mercy. But generally speaking, you'll play a very similar talent build, and you'll just do a ton of damage. It's really fun getting to that, 5 stacks of Justification and slamming, like, Bastion of Light, triple Shield of the Righteous, Divine Toll, just like cranking damage. Paladins are going to do some serious harm to enemies in this next season. Avenger Shield is also going to be a very powerful tool in this upcoming Mythic Plus pool because there's a lot of casters, quite frankly. That's one reason why Demon Hunter and Death Knight are looking really strong, where, Warrior has its niches. We'll get to that in a bit. Monk is an okay kit for interrupting that kind of stuff, but Paladin's just going to be good. They have an ability to block spells. Their consecration when they are in it, when you're a mastery stacking class, fucking insane. The only downside is going to be that consecration and that movement, and if that's not something you're going to enjoy, I recommend looking for another tank. Death Knight's really fun. Or, I would obviously suggest something more lines of like Warrior or Brewmaster, but there's some other good tanks out there. Maybe you take a break from the Paladin for this season. If you like the idea of standing in your consecration and just doing really big damage, fucking do it. Go play it. It's good outside of the set looking like ass. I don't really have much else to say about the Paladin. Bop is going to be a very, very useful ability. So if you're not playing with Holy Paladin, or if Holy Paladin isn't shaping up to be meta, having that on your tank is going to be very good. Obviously, having additional interrupts if we're playing a caster cleave with Avenger, so having Avenger Shield, also very, very good. The Paladin in a caster comp plays well, so there are things, to look at in a positive sense for the Paladin. I was going to say something else, but now I'm kind of forgetting, so I don't remember. Oh, yeah, going back to Bop, there are a lot of instances in Ataldazar, in Waycrest Manor, in Darkheart Thicket, where Bop becomes a very, very strong spell. So it'll be interesting to see where they end up falling, because Paladin has had its ups and downs throughout Dragonflight so far. Going from kind of extremely weak in the very start of the first season to being very, very strong and almost required in high-end keys, to starting out really strong in Season 2 and then falling kind of to middle of the pack once the Holy Paladin rework came in and the Guardian Druid rework came in. And now they're going to be strong again. So if you want to try to ride that wave, best of luck to you. I said these are going to be quick, and I'm definitely spending like 6 to 7 minutes talking about each one. Okay, last but not least, we have probably my favorite 2 tanks, and not because their sets are good and not because they're going to be meta, but because I just like the playstyle in general. So let's talk about the Warrior really quick, and then I'll finish it up with the Brewmaster. The Prot Warrior set has had its ups and downs over the course of this season, or I should say this PTR cycle. It went from being very, very overpowered to being almost... People were thinking, like, we won't even run our tier set because it's so bad, to being, okay, this is pretty fucking dope. So just a quick little history lesson for the PTR cycle is our Fervid Bite would consume bleeds at 100% value. So it turned basically Shield Slam into it was basically doing 30 to 35% of our single target damage, if not more, depending on crits. But the 4 set was really weak. So there was speculation that you could run 2 and 2. There was speculation that maybe you just run it. So what they ended up doing is they nerfed it from 100% of your bleed consumption to 40% of your bleed consumption, which sucked because it made it so Thunderous Roar would get consumed at 40% value, but the meat of that ability comes from the damage over time effect. So you would use your really strong ability, and then it would get consumed for only 40% of the value, and the cooldown reduction that you would get from the 4-set on Thunderous Roar was not enough to justify that 60% loss. So what they did is they made it so that the 4-set, instead of doing 1 second, it's now 3 seconds, which was fine, but that still was a damage loss. And then finally, they made it that it consumes 40% of your bleed, but 100% of Thunderous Roar, which is perfect. I do have some issues with the set, though. It does a lot of damage, and it's very, very good in Mythic Plus. It makes the Warrior's damage extremely consistent. I mean, Warriors had a pretty consistent damage palette, but now, with Thunderous Roar being a 30 to 45 second cooldown, or maybe closer to a minute, depending on what talents you're playing, you're now doing really high damage all the time. Every pull you're going in and you're getting a Thunderous Roar out. Not to mention that, you're consuming bleeds almost frequently, so your priority damage is much higher, and not to mention that you're getting a flat 10 to 16% DR, depending on if you have the 2-set or 4-set, and depending on how many bleeds are currently active on the target. More than likely, you'll have anywhere from 1 to 3 bleeds. Normally, you'll have a 14% DR permanently once you have the 4-set. It just depends, though, on what target you're hitting. The tier set is kind of unique because it's based on your rage spent, so spending rage has a chance to give you the fervid opposition buff. Problem is that some abilities, unless they fix this, I haven't looked at it today, so at the time of recording this video, I'm assuming it's still the same, but things like Ignore Pain, despite it being a lower rage cost, or the similar rage cost, still has a way higher chance to proc fervid opposition compared to something like Execute or Shield Block. So basically, moral of the story is, this isn't really a big deal, but make sure you're keeping up Ignore Pain, and then as you're, applying Ignore Pain for yourself, you're going to naturally generate that fervid opposition buff to make sure you have the DR active at all times. My biggest complaint about the set, I would say, is that it feels like it wants you to play a bleed build, which is fine, and it's really good for damage. But if you're trying to optimize your damage, you're already losing out on utility, which the Warrior already struggles with. I think Intervene should be baseline. It's not. It's a talent we have to pick, so we don't even have Intervene. It's kind of difficult to justify picking up Intimidating Shout because it is a longer cooldown. It only hits a certain amount of targets. There's a damage threshold on it. Very difficult to pick up. If you want to optimize your tier set's damage and uptime, well, it's very difficult to justify playing Shockwave if you're trying to play all of the Thunderous Roar talents, like Uproar and Thunderous Words. So you have to, do you drop Unstoppable Force? Do you drop Shockwave? Or do you just gimp your tier set a little bit to have that Shockwave utility? So Prot Warrior is kind of going to struggle in that sense, especially in a season where you need a lot of stops and there's a lot of magic damage. Now, of course, you have Spell Block, you have Spell Reflect. Ignore Pain is pretty good against magic in a sense. So in those lights, Warrior can do a lot. You also have access to things like Stormbolt, so you have an additional stop there. You have a slightly shorter kick, especially if you play into like Honed Instincts and like the reduced pummel cooldown. You can get like a 13-second kick instead of a 15. That's beneficial. But overall, I would say Warrior is definitely going to be one of, if not one of the weakest tanks out of the bunch. I personally want to play it though because it's just fun. It's a fast-paced, kind of aggressive, fairly nuanced, high skill cap tank because there's a couple of different things you have to keep track of, from Shield Block to Ignore Pain. Spell Reflect optimization is always really fun for me. I love trying to figure that out, recognizing when a cast is going through or calling it out to my group, like let this go through, figuring out how to stand in certain things, figuring out what dots I can reflect or what boss mechanics. Neltharian's Lair is really, really fun. I did a video about that a long time ago, how to kind of optimize your spell reflex in there. Just a lot of fun. Warrior, in terms of utility, going to be weak. Tier set's really fun, so take that how you want. I will be playing it as my kind of secondary tank this next patch, alongside my Brewmaster, which we'll get into now. Oh man, okay, Brewmaster. This class sucks. No, I'm kidding. The set bonus itself is fairly underwhelming compared to the other tank sets, and honestly, I feel like it's really weak compared to some of the other tank sets, and let me explain here in a second. So nothing about the tank is really changing, because the tier set is adding a priority to fire damage, and if you aren't familiar with the tank, or you just don't know how to read, we have a couple of fire damaging abilities. We have Breath of Fire, obviously. We have Charred Passions versus Dragonfire Brew, and Dragonfire Brew technically replaces Breath of Fire. So you have basically Breath of Fire, Charred Passions, Exploding Keg, and then Dragonfire Brew could replace Charred Passions and Breath of Fire. If you know anything about math, having 3 abilities that deal fire damage is much better than having 2 abilities that do fire damage. So most likely with this tier set, I need to do a little bit more research because I was going to do a guide on this, but basically the consensus seems like you're not going to change off of Charred Passions because it just generally does more HPS with the new tier set. The new tier set, if you aren't familiar, it increases your Breath of Fire damage a little bit. That's fine. Has some synergy with Dragonfire Brew, has some synergy with Blackout Combo, but it heals you for a percentage of the fire damage you deal just permanently. This interacts very nice with Stagger, and it interacts very nicely with Celestial Fortune because it's going to be double dipping into Celestial Fortune with your crit, double dipping into your verse, and having good synergy with Stagger. It makes the Brewmaster a little bit more capable, I guess, of keeping itself up, especially during Exploding Keg windows. The 4 set, though, is really shit, in my opinion. And the reason it's shit is because it's similar to the Guardian Druid Shield, except instead of lasting for 45 seconds, it lasts for 8. And it can get consumed very quickly, because basically what it does is the fire damage you deal, over the duration of combat will store up as like a silent aura or a silent buff, or invisible. I don't know what word to use here. But basically, it stores up a small percentage of the fire damage you deal, and then the next time you cast Celestial Brew, it will give you an additional shield that absorbs all damage that would have been staggered. So it's like a second absorb value on anything that's staggered. So you're staggering off some damage, you're just preventing it, right? Or it's coming through. And then, but the damage that you would stagger, that whatever you're, based off of having Shuffle active and depends on your agility. But let's just say you have 80% stagger, that 80% just won't hit you at all. So you're only taking 20% damage to the face, and the rest is just being totally ignored. It's not building on your current stagger level. The problem I have with this is, 1, the shield gets consumed very quickly. So when you look at most tanks who have like anywhere between a 10 to 20% or 25, Guardian Druid has a 25% DR during their duration, Brewmaster is getting it's technically a very, very high DR for a very short window. And this can be great, but in Mythic Plus, especially in high Mythic Plus, this is going to get consumed almost immediately. And on top of that, it's capped at our max max health. Now, this doesn't really matter as much because typically we're not even hitting that absorb cap unless you're just not hitting Celestial Brew on cooldown, which in higher content you typically are. There's sometimes you'll save it for a specific mechanic, but normally it's not gonna hit cap anyways. So the set bonus feels, I get what they're trying to do. It's fairly thematic to the raid. It's based around fire damage, replicated shadow flame damage, fire damage being absorbed and then used to like your benefit. That's cool and all, but it's kind of bland, and it feels significantly weaker than a lot of the other tank tier sets. Brewmaster still do a ton of damage, so if you like doing a lot of damage, it's a good season to do it. And the tier set the healing component of the tier set feels good in like lower level content where you're taking very kind of soft damage intake where you're able to kind of sustain yourself. But in higher level content, I would say anything 20s and up. Through a lot of my testing, there were times where I was like, oh shit. In terms of utility, the Brewmaster has Ring of Peace, Paralysis, as well as a short kick, but this is a tank that significantly needs a rework to their tree, both the class tree and the spec tree. I'm sure a lot of other content creators or people who play these specs seriously would probably agree with. The class tree is pretty horrendous with a lot of its movement. There's a lot of talents in there that are somewhat dead, and I think they could do a lot better by adding things like Weapons of Order or Phalanx Snap or even Bonus Brew to the capstones of the tree and get rid of those fucking statues, in my opinion. There's a lot of 2 talent nodes that don't need to be 2 talent nodes. Monk needs a rework. 10.3 if there is one, or 11.0 I'm really hoping is the season where they take a hard look at Monk. They don't need to really change too much about the playstyle, but I think they need to address some of the things in the tree like the statues, like I just brought up as a great example. There's a lot of abilities that are in every spec tree, like Bone Dust Brew, but aren't in this, like why aren't they in the class tree? Or like Phalanx Stomp. It's not for Brewmaster, but both Windwalker. Give it to fucking Brewmaster, man. Phalanx Stomp was dope as shit. It was so fun to play with in Shadowlands. While it wasn't meta. Okay, hold on. I'm gonna get. Am I ranting here? Holy fuck. Basically, what I'm saying is that there's a lot of opportunities for them to do what they kind of did with Demon Hunter by taking a lot of the shit that was in their spec trees, move them to the class tree, and add cool, interactive, fun talents to the spec trees, and they can make some cool things baseline. Why can't... Dude, do you know how many times I want to take Clash, but I can't take Clash? So many times. Every Spiteful week, basically. Anyways, I don't want to really rant too much. Basically, Brewmaster is in a very similar state that it was in Season 2 and Season 1. It's going to be an average tank at best. Obviously, some top-end performers like Mordrim, Equinox, as well as any other capable tank who wants to play Brewmaster can succeed on it, but it's going to be an uphill battle. I promise you that. Anyways, yeah, I think that's kind of it from me. I kind of want to end this video just by giving you kind of a quick snapshot of the way that I would rank the tanks in terms of performance in Mythic Plus. Now, again, this isn't like a serious tier list. I'm just kind of giving you my general thoughts after personally testing it. I would say VDH is probably going to be the front runner, followed by a strong showing from both Death Knight as well as Prop Paladin. After that, I would probably put Warrior, Guardian, Druid, and Monk in the same kind of tier row. I don't think these tanks are going to be bad. I just think they're at a slight disadvantage, and it really is going to come down to what comp you're running with. Obviously, having an augmentation evoker, as most of us have experienced so far since they've been released, is a very powerful tool and asset and a class to have in a key because it stops so much. It provides additional healing and benefits and damage reduction and all this fun stuff that makes tanking feel good. I will say this. I think their tuning that they did this tier has been immaculate. This PTR testing cycle, normally there's kind of these crazy standout tanks, but all of them feel good. A lot of them are in the same range of dealing damage in similar pools. I did a lot of testing like in a Taldazar by doing a lot of consistent solo, pulls where I would try to figure out how much damage, how much healing, how much utility that these classes would have. Maybe I'll do a video on that if people are interested. But basically, most of the tanks fall in a very similar range. What's normally going to come down to is utility and obviously optimizing the most perfect comp to do the highest end content. In terms of what I'm going to play, if you're interested, Brewmaster and Prot Warrior, because not that they're going to be strong, but because I like them. So I recommend playing what you enjoy, fuck the meta, and just that's why you pay for a fucking sub. You pay money to play this game. Play what you want. Holy fuck. Why do I have to say that? Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know what you guys think down below. What tanks are you looking forward to, or what tanks are you maybe steering away from? Prop Paladin. I'm sorry if this video was a little ranty. I just wanted to kind of get my thoughts out. I thought it was important. I thought a lot of you guys have been asking me to kind of give my thoughts, so this is probably the best time to do it. If you're looking for any kind of guides, I'm probably going to make a Brewmaster guide here shortly for the next patch. I don't think I'll do any guides for any other tank unless I get seriously into it in the upcoming patch. If I was going to do a guide for anything, it'd probably be something along the lines of Warrior and maybe VDH if I get around to it. Anyways, a massive shout out to all my Patreon supporters. I appreciate you guys so much. I hope you guys are all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.